For the next 2 hours, you will have a story and the kind of quiet that lets it breathe.
A law beneath the law. Let nothing change except memory.
We don't erase, we redistribute.
Recognition administered like policy. A face taught to behave.
Beauty trained to sound like policy.
Silence is enforced. Witness present.
If they move memory, move witness together. Breathe slowly. Keep your own time.
I once believed that silence was a holy climate, one you entered like a chapel, one that met you with cool air and stillness and the good fatigue of kneeling. I know better now. Silence was not sacred. It was enforced. It hung from the rafters like netting, invisible until you were caught, until you felt the tug at the throat each time you tried to speak. My name will not help you. If you were to find it, you would discover that it had been tidily reassigned to some life, with orderly edges, a school ledger here, a parish roster there, a death notice, stamped with a seal that does not smudge even in rain. Take it as proof that what I'm telling you matters. The ledgers do not waste ink on the harmless. The corridor where it began lay below the public archive, beneath the very shelves that guide docents brag about. People who visit believe they have seen the Vatican's belly. They go home with postcards of round reading rooms and cheerful lamps, and they tell their friends about the smell of leather and the little brass plates that wink on the stacks. What they never smell is iron gall ink tired as blood, nor the strange, almost medical chill of paper that's been kept at a perfect humidity for so many centuries that it has forgotten what autumn is. They do not see the stairwell with the steps that recede as you go down, as though the building itself were gently urging you to turn back. Down there, the air is a different century. Your breath sits close to your face like a veil. Sound does not travel. It kneels. The light does not glow. It agrees to be present. The night I broke my oath, I carried a small lantern with a thumb-sized wick and a kinked handle that had rubbed black into my palm over years of use. I could have taken one of the newer electric torches from the custodial closet, but the lantern made honest shadows, and I needed honesty more than I needed certainty. The door I sought had no handle. It offered a ring of iron, slick with the wetness that stone sweats when it remembers the sea. Around the ring ran a brief sentence in a crabbed hand the color of tired roots. I had translated it 12 times, from 12 angles in my mind, and always arrived at roughly the same meaning. Turn not, lest you unbind the ledger of faces. We were taught to register such warnings, note the call number for the supervising priest, and dismiss the temptation as if we had recognized it in a confessional and shrugged it off for penance. But if the church had wanted the door to remain forever shut, it would have buried it behind plaster like an old fresco too strange to keep. Instead, it placed a sentence at the threshold, as if daring the curious to choose obedience publicly before disobedience in secret. The door was a test that graded itself. I want to tell you that my reasons for opening it were noble, or, at least, that I was compelled by a string of coincidences so exquisitely unreasonable that to resist would have been to defy Providence. The truth is duller and more dangerous. I was tired of seeing annotations that were stronger than the text they corrected. I was tired of footnotes that walked. I was tired of librarians who told me, quietly, how to find what they told me, louder, to leave alone. The first time I heard the words Micro-Canon, they were whispered at the grill of my confessional by a man who smelled like long travel, old wool, and the metallic tang of coins counted too often. His voice had the practiced humility of a penitent who knows he will sin again and who hopes that the repetition counts as endurance. He said only that he had followed a reference from a scriptorium catalog to a ledger that did not appear in any index, that the ledger concerned articles of exchange, and that the margin notes were written in a hand that looked like glass felt. "I think," he said, and here the thinness of the grill made the whisper feel like air passing through bone. "I think the margins are the book. You must understand, I was a priest by ordination, but before that, and always, I was a librarian. I loved bindings not as objects but as promises. I loved the way some books, even when shelved properly, always seemed to lean toward a particular direction, as if listening. I knew which ink was made with iron gall that had been soaked too long and would spread like bruises across the fibers of the page. I knew which scribes had hands that trembled just at the loop of a descender and nowhere else, and I could recognize a forgery by the way the pen obeyed a fear it didn't need to have. I say this so that when I tell you that the Micro-Canon is real, you will not imagine I am a tourist of secrets, a hobbyist of the forbidden who comes for the thrill and leaves with souvenirs. I am a custodian of paper. I know where truth hides. The key I used that night was not stamped with authority. It was a blank I had filed myself over a year, 1 stroke per day, a discipline disguised as fidgeting. You would be surprised how many locks submit to patience. The ring surrendered after a tug, and the door, which had endured the slow pressure of centuries, disliked motion and made sure I knew it. The groan the hinges gave was not loud, but it was long, and when it ended, I realized I had been leaning against sound the way one leans against wind. The absence of it nearly toppled me. Beyond the threshold, the corridor narrowed as if the stone had been laid by hands that distrusted open space. The walls were dull with salt bloom that, in my light, looked like letters that had almost made their way to legibility before deciding that surviving as suggestion was safer. After 10 paces, the lantern's flame stopped behaving like a flame and began to behave like a witness. It did not dance, it decided. There is a cold peculiar to rooms that have sworn to keep things. It is not unwelcoming. It is not cruel. It is the temperature of thought when it offends power. That cold met me in the vestibule and asked my name without words. I did not give it, partly because I had just decided to let it go, and partly because I knew the door could still close behind me and fix everything as it had been. It is odd how quickly a rule feels like weather and weather like law. You will want to know what I carried, because the mind believes that if the inventory is ordinary, then the event can only be extraordinary by theft. There was the lantern. There was a pencil stub licked flat on one side. There was a little stack of paper I had trimmed from the margins of damaged registers, clean slips with the deckled edge still rough like a scab. There was a rosary. I do not mention it to impress you with devotion. I mention it because the weight of it in my pocket reminded me that even beads can be a ledger, and that prayers are often counted in circles rather than lines. It is useful, when you intend to betray an institution, to carry a small symbol of the thing you still love. The room beyond the vestibule had no furnishings except for a chest and a desk, and the feeling that it had briefly been abandoned by someone who meant to come right back and never did. Dust lay in a discipline I recognize. Dust that has been allowed to accumulate according to a rule. It bore no footprints because footprints testify too crudely. Instead, dust collected in crescendos and rests, as if it had been trained to imitate music, as if someone had told it to rehearse silence and make the rehearsal beautiful. The chest was labeled in a hand I knew immediately, a scribe we called the threader, whose marginalia usually tied the mind into pretty knots before soothing it with a small, obedient bow. The label read Feria Quarta, then a line of admonitory humor that made my skin tighten. On Wednesdays, do not breathe too loudly. This is how the archives hide the heavy objects. Behind jokes so small you would be embarrassed to notice them. Other drawers tell you about the charters of kings and the dispensations of popes and the engineerings of calendars. This box told you to mind your breath. The sense of it was obvious at once. Breath is a kind of timestamp. Breath fogs things and reveals the distance you stand from them. The person who wrote that label had known that air itself was an instrument of memory. Inside, neatly, unimaginatively, almost disappointingly, lay a stack of papers bound not with ribbon, but with thread knotted at intervals precisely mirroring the content. A knot at every clause that concerned consideration, a knot at every clause concerning witness, a knot at every clause concerning transference. There were signatures in hands fine enough to make the scrape of the nib feel sacrilegious. There were seals whose wax had not crumbled, because its recipe had included something the recipe admitted only as eterna in a slanted hand. Eternal, which I had always taken as a joke. Here it looked like a stone that had been polished by palms that never rested. I read, and try now to describe to you not only the words, but the sensation of reading them, which was like discovering that a language you thought you understood had, all along, been conjugating your impatience. The document called itself an article of exchange. It was as dull as tax code and as frightening as proof. Every eighth line carried meanings that strained like cloistered animals behind proverbs. The phrase that first cut me was simple. Nihil mutetur, nisi memoria. Let nothing change except memory. I had seen that line before, in a different context, in a scholastic debate about the continuity of sacramental effect. Here it sat, without fanfare, in the second paragraph of a clause governing transference of ledger, and it made my mouth go dry in a way that had nothing to do with the air. Ledger. The word seems harmless until you realize it is the only technology the past trusts. The articles described a procedure named pactum visus, the exchange of souls. Not the theft, not the destruction. An exchange, as if the soul were a weight on a balance, and all that was needed was a change of bookkeeping to move the weight from one pan to the other while the scale itself remained the same. If you think this is metaphor, you have never worked in a scriptorium. The world turns on the competence of its clerks. The parties are two, the supplicant and the custodial order. The consideration is peculiar. Memoria solvenda, memories surrendered until due. The witness is not a man but a book, a ledger, whose authority consists in the number of other ledgers that repeat it. The time is set under a fixed star, which is less poetry than arithmetic. We once charted the hours according to a sky now forgotten, except by those who keep it in drawers. I read through to the counter pledge, and there I found a sigil I recognized from the corners of manuscripts that pretended to be purely devotional while telling the steadiest lies. An angel's name drawn not in letters but in hinges, and loops more architectural than calligraphic. It insisted that the new ledger be inscribed not to bless, but to bind. In other words, a saint's signature used as a lock. If the soul was unchanged, what moved? The remembered self, not the self that wakes to hunger and soreness and the smell of sweat and wool, but the self other people greet in you, the accumulation of greetings that makes a person public. The articles made it boring. They made it sound like a change of address. They made it survivable. They made it something a respectable man could ask for. I do not know how long I stood there, reading. Time behaves strangely when you handle paper meant to bend it. It felt like someone had removed half the minutes from the hour, like a dentist pulls teeth so that the jaw can close without pain. When I finally looked up, the door had become a shape, not an object, and I understood that if I closed it behind me, the corridor would not be there when I turned the knob again. Rooms that keep things keep themselves first. I took notes on those ragged slips. I had brought notes in the hand I had practiced for years to look like a man who is neither hurried nor afraid. I wrote the line about memory 3 times, as if repetition could make the sentence behave, as if writing it in my script could persuade it to betray the ledger it came from. I copied the schedule of stars, marking the nights of Regulus and Aldebaran and Antares, familiar as saints, strange as accomplices. I drew the hinge sigil and felt the lantern's flame thin, as if the room were inhales and my pencil strokes counted as dust. The desk across from the chest held a narrow volume no thicker than a missal, pressed by the hands of a careful grandmother. It should not have belonged with the articles, but families of books are like families of men. What sits together is not always what shares blood. The cover bore no title, only a band of darker leather where a title had been peeled away. Inside I found what I had not allowed myself to hope for: case notes. A clerk's record, written without adjectives, about exchanges conducted according to the articles. The first concerned a scholar who had discovered, with proofs that frightened even him, that the calendar we used had been engineered to flatter a dynasty. The entry listed dates, witnesses, the hour the star was consulted, the ceremony's duration, and the location of the new ledger into which the man would henceforth be inscribed. The final line recorded, with an almost relieved neatness, the scholar's subsequent life, a position as a consultant on minor miracles, a pension, quiet evenings. The word quiet landed with the weight of a threat. Another note summarized an exchange involving an artist whose frescoes taught people to look for patterns their rulers could not control. The ledger assigned him a new history, a modest apprenticeship, a fatal fever, the sort of career that does not rise high enough to cast ungovernable shadows. There was no mention of the paintings that, according to a footnote written later, could still be found if one knew which chapel's blue had been repaired with a slightly cheaper azurite that dissolves the light differently. I felt the temptation you always feel when the secret you have sought reveals itself as a bureaucracy, to laugh. My laugh died in my throat because it sounded like gratitude. Of course, the worst of it was filed and cross-referenced and tied up in string. Evil does not wear horns. It wears competence. No one, looking into those drawers, would have called it monstrous. They would have called it complete. The lantern made a sound like a sigh. I remembered that fire is alive. I remembered the dictation our novice master gave us, the day we took on custodial duties in the library. Trust your hand more than your head. The head lies to itself first. My hand reached for the chest again and found, beneath the first stack of articles, a smaller bundle bound with linen that had once been white. The heading in the threader's glass hand was simple: Descriptor on the scribe. It was a guide for those who would write the exchanges. It insisted that the penman must be pure of history, that he must be a person no one remembers for anything unscheduled, no jokes so good they outlast a night, no acts so kind that they grow new versions of themselves in other people's recollections. The scribe must be a stone the river cannot recognize later, the guide said, and I felt the insult hit me Godward. My whole life I had tried to be remembered by books. This guide advised me to become a page no one cited. If you are wondering whether I considered turning back, you are not the only one. The mind speaks in favors at such moments. Think of the vows, think of the ears that trust your voice. Think of the lunches with old men who will die comforted if you remain boring. Then there was the other voice, also inside, patient without mercy. If nothing changes except memory, then memory is where you come in. I have always hated the part of myself that speaks like a title. I think I would have stayed standing there, negotiating with a coward who had learned to imitate prudence had there not been a sound. It came from the wall opposite the desk, a sound too even for footsteps and too soft for stone settling. It was a ticking not aligned with the clock in the hall above. It counted in a different scale. I moved the lantern closer and found a narrow brass door almost flush with the stone. On its face someone had engraved a pattern of loops and tiny wedges like the seam of a seashell. The door was not locked. It had been shamed into remaining closed by the habit of those who passed it. When I opened it, the cold inside was new, not the ceremonial chill of kept paper, but the bodily cold of air that has not touched breath for a long time. Inside the recess sat a device I recognized from the margins where miracle and machine pretend to be strangers. A simple balance, a ledger's scale. On one pan lay a little cylinder of wax stamped with an angel's hinge name. On the other lay nothing but the memory that it had once held something important. The arm was level. The sight of it made me sick, with a kind of admiration that tastes like betrayal. If you want to make a world obedient, you do not break its bones. You persuade its balances. There was a ledge beneath the scale, and on it a book the size of a man's palm, thin, worn, elastic with use. Its title was handwritten without flourish, Index of Faces. The pages were onion skin, and the script inside was a marvel of restraint. Each entry listed a face not in adjectives round, narrow, noble, but in the way a face moves through other faces, the way laughter breaks early on one side, the crease that appears only at a name, the stare that imitates listening but is really a well. After each description, a line, ledger assignment. Then a number that matched, almost always, the numbers I had seen in the article's margins. The index did not tell you what a man was. It told you how the world agreed to recognize him. I had been a confessor for years. I thought I knew the inventory of the human face. I had not understood that recognition itself could be administered as policy. I traced a description that reminded me of a scholar I respected, laugher late, eyes that greet you twice, a mouth that holds its quiet between words like a coin you do not spend. The ledger assignment number was not the one I knew. The world had agreed to greet him differently. My stomach tightened the way it does before a fever chooses its temperature. For a moment I considered that perhaps all this was a theater staged to frighten the curious, that the papers were brilliant forgeries made to dilute the appetite for mischief. I have seen such things done priests who direct visitors to forbidden rooms hung with careful monstrosities so that the visitor might go home happy to be bored. But the thing about forgery is this: even the best cannot discipline dust the way truth does. Dust lies differently when people respect it. The dust here was devout. The pencil shook in my hand for the first time. I scratched down a sentence that embarrassed me even as I set it to paper because it sounded like a boy at a window, speaking to darkness. If they can move memory like this, what is left to stand on? In reply, not from the room, but from the habit that had grown inside me all these years, came the simplest of answers: witness. I did not believe then that witness could be enough. I am not sure I believe it now. But witness is what truth has when the books are against it. Someone had written on the back cover of the index a phrase in the threader's glass hand I had never seen before. We do not erase. We redistribute. The brevity of it made the breath go shallow. The kindness of it was the worst. To redistribute is to pretend that justice has been done merely because movement occurred. In this room, redistribution wore a halo made of hinges. There are moments in a life when the narrative that will later be called courage is created by exhaustion. I was tired of being careful and of calling that care discernment. I slid the index into my robe. It fit against my ribs like a patient animal. I slipped 3 of the articles into the sleeve, where a man might conceal a letter to a woman he is too ashamed to love openly. I closed the brass door as gently as I could so that the scale would not jolt, and then I turned to the greater problem, leaving a room that might decide, out of loyalty to its contents, to keep me. On the way back to the threshold, I stopped at the chest one last time. Beneath the linen-wrapped guide, I found a scrap of vellum with a note in a hasty hand that was not the threader's. It quoted the line that had hurt me: "Let nothing change except memory," and had added a tiny equation: memory equals witness x repetition. That is not how memory works in the brain. It is exactly how memory works in the world. For a priest, for a librarian, for anyone who lives by the recitation of texts, the equation might as well be law. The implication, bit like cold air. If repetition multiplies witness, then a man who tells the truth twice is more dangerous than a man who tells 2 truths once. The door waited. Doors are like hourglasses. Their weight is time pretending to be wood. I pulled the iron ring, and the hinges protested with a noise like someone remembering a wound that was once elegant. On the far side of the threshold, the corridor had not changed, which is to say it had changed only in the way a corridor changes when it knows you differently. The lantern's halo thickened again into honest light. The stairs that had seemed to recede now shrugged forward as if accepting my weight. I climbed without counting steps until my legs began to count for me. At the top of the stair was the library proper, the place tourists believe is the whole. Its lamps were asleep in their shades. I passed the long tables where, in daylight, scholars unfold little personal worlds and ask the big world to wait. I laid the articles under a sheaf of catalogues that would mislead anyone in a hurry. I kept the index against my ribs. It had begun to feel like a word I could not yet pronounce. Before leaving, I stood in the doorway and listened for anything that sounded like a story turning toward me. The room did what rooms do after they've allowed a sin. It pretended it had only ever been respectable. I stepped into the hall and closed the door behind me. And when the latch clicked, a small, undignified grief surprised me. Institutions are houses. We love them in the way we love the rooms where we first learned our names. To betray a house is to betray the weather inside your own chest. But fidelity to rooms is not a virtue when the floorboards cover graves. I did not go to my cell. I walked instead to the chapel that most people forget exists, because it is so determinedly plain, the little box with whitewashed walls and a crucifix that refuses ornament. I knelt not to pray, not because I am proud of that, but because I wanted the posture to remind me that knees know what the mouth forgets. The index was warm where it had rested under my robe. I held it like a man might hold a child he has just realized he must hide. The ridiculousness of that simile saved me from tears. The first name in the index, first not because it began with A, but because it fell open there, belonged to a man I had confessed a dozen times. He had a way of making even his admissions sound like liturgy, careful, rehearsed, the shame arranged so that it would tidy itself up afterward. The description of his face was perfect and merciless. The ledger assignment number did not match the number on the form I had filled a month earlier when he took on a new duty at the library. I read the line again and again like a madman bargaining with arithmetic. The world had been taught to greet him differently. He had been redistributed. The rosary in my pocket prickled like a nettle against my wrist. I counted a decade, not because I intended to, but because my fingers have long since learned to save me from my intentions. On the 10th bead, a memory came back that I am ashamed to admit I had allowed to fade. A woman, the shape of fatigue around her eyes like a bruise, standing at my confessional and asking me why her husband had changed without changing. He laughs, she had said, but it is not the laugh that remembers me. I had given her a speech about stress. I had told her to sleep. I had suggested a retreat. I had told myself that a practical answer is a kind of balm. In the chapel, with the index yawning like a thin mouth in my palm, I understood that I had done precisely what the articles required. I had obeyed the redistribution by making it sensible. I closed the book and felt, not courage, but that austere cousin of courage, that priest's mistake for humility, the willingness to become small enough to fit through a necessary door. I say this to shame myself into honesty later. What I had done so far was theft, not testimony. I had taken words. The harder part would be taking consequences. The door I had opened below was not the last. There is always another door. The corridor to my cell was ordinary. It was lined with sober paintings of men who had taught themselves to write without leaning. Their frames were undecorated. Their faces were almost indistinguishable from one another, except for that light at the eyes you sometimes see in craftsmen who have discovered that their trade can harmonize the world like a tuning fork. I wanted to ask them how they had lived with their knowledge. The hallway, being a hallway, offered only the advice that furniture gives. Stand where you are placed. Accept dust kindly. Let footsteps be valid. On my desk I had left, that morning, an open ledger of acquisitions. The column headings were a comfort: date, accession, donor, condition, notes. Columns are a librarian's prayer. I laid the index on the desk and then slid it beneath the ledger so that the desk would look a little ordinary again. Then I sat, the way a boy sits after running, and allowed my mind to move through the facts like a monk through a cloister walk. One foot placed deliberately in front of the other, each step an agreement with the geometry of the world. Fact. The articles exist. Fact. They are written to be obeyed by people who believe in order. Fact. The index exists. Fact. It is administered by hands that do not tremble. Fact. The phrase "let nothing change except memory" is not a metaphor. Fact. I am a witness. Fact. Witness is, historically, murdered or ignored. I do not know how long I sat there. Time, when it has been indicted, does not wear a watch. I must have drifted, because I woke with my cheek on the acquisitions ledger and the smell of paper in my nose like a tonic. The room was blue with the hour that comes before morning admits its defeat. I tucked the index deeper into the desk, in the false bottom I had made years ago for reasons that now look like a rehearsal for small disobediences, for the predictable sin of a man who loves thresholds too much. Before I slept again, if what I did can be called sleep and not a truce, I told myself a sentence, as one tells a child a story, so that he will believe the night can conclude without crisis. Tomorrow, you will return the key, and no one will know. In the morning, my hand would write reports with the calm of a hand that has found its vocation. In the afternoon, the lamps would grow warm and sway slightly as they always did when the building breathed. In the evening, I would be asked to hear confessions, and I would hear, and I would assign penances that made men believe they had balanced their ledgers. And in that regularity, not in drama, not in alarms, not in torches and chanting, would live the most profound danger, the ease with which a life can agree to be a seal. I did sleep, eventually. In that sleep I dreamed not of angels but of hinges, hinges as large as cathedrals, hinges small as the bones inside a finger, hinges that turned without friction, and hinges that screamed at their own obedience. When I woke, a prayer had arranged itself in the mind without my permission, the way ivy arranges itself on stone and calls it mercy. If nothing must change except memory, then make me a ruin that remembers. I am Catholic enough to know that this is not theology. It is simply a way of telling the truth to come and live somewhere in me and pay no rent. When I rose, when morning showed itself as a clean sheet across the floor, when the bells tested the day with a sound that has never once asked for anyone's consent, I did not know that by nightfall I would witness an exchange. I did not know that witness would ask for more than my eyes. I did not know that memory, once weaponized, does not return to being a keepsake. I knew only the small things, that the shoes by the door were dry from last night's dust, that the rosary had left a gentle welt on my wrist, that the desk, patient as furniture, had accepted the index the way a grave accepts a body, with good manners and the intention of keeping it. Outside, the hall smelled of bread from the kitchen, where men who have never read a footnote make loaves that teach the day how to be thick and kind. I turned toward the library, and the library, being a library, would have forgiven me everything if I had asked. But forgiveness is a ledger too, and there are entries that cannot be reversed by a priest talking to himself in a corridor at dawn. There are doors that once opened insist on staying open in the mind. There are sentences that once read begin to speak you. I tell you all this not to inflate the first step with poetry, but to give it weight. The door I opened was not an image. It was oak and iron, and a script the color of dried roots, and it carried inside it the cool persistence of exact words. Turn not, lest you unbind the ledger of faces. I turned, I unbound. That is the confession. Everything after this is only the arithmetic of what a turn decides. I did not return to the lower room for 3 days. I stayed away the way a man stays away from a river after it has shown him that drowning is tidy. From the outside, those days looked like good behavior. I catalogued a donation of hymnals, bound in brittle calf. I wrote 3 letters on behalf of scholars whose visas had become questions. I served 2 masses and heard a dozen confessions and ate at a table where the soup had learned to apologize for not being bread. I smiled, and the smile felt like a label that had been affixed by a confident clerk. The 4th morning I went down again, not because courage had arrived overnight folded on a chair, but because the thought of obedience had begun to feel like mold in my lungs. The lantern took the steps with me, as if it had never left. The door met my hand the way a dog meets the hand that remembers how to scratch its ears, wary, glad, resigned. The chill inside greeted me by title. Rooms that keep secrets are more polite than people. The chest was still where I had left it. The dust had rehearsed itself to perfection. I pulled the thread-bound stack back into the light and laid it open to the claws that had bitten me before. Nihil mutetur nisi memoria. Let nothing change except memory. The phrase behaved differently now that it had slept inside my pocket for 3 days and warmed itself against the ribs. It had lost its posture as a threat. It had become a rubric. If you have never copied law, word for word, you do not know the tenderness that can grow between your hand and a sentence you despise. To copy is to lend the enemy your breath. To annotate is to make intimacy a weapon. I copied the articles slowly, translating as I went into the common register my mind uses when it wants to remember without permission. I made the language a narrow bridge I could cross at night. Article 1. Parties. The supplicant is recorded by baptismal name and by traces of recognition the particular ways others greet him, the motions of face and voice that make him legible. The custodial order is recorded by office and seal. A third party, unnumbered and unthanked, is implied by the schedule, the unmoving star under which the minute must be chosen. Article 2. Consideration. Memoria solvenda, memories surrendered until due. Not all at once, not annihilated, but escrowed like coin in a temple whose priests also run the marketplace. The supplicant grants to the order the right to manage recognition. In return, the supplicant is assigned a new ledger, a corrected context, a social weather that will no longer storm against his roof. Article 3. Witness. Not a person, but a book, a ledger with authority proportional to its concordances, that is, to the number of other books that repeat it without attribution. The witness ledger is the machine into which the world will be fed until the world agrees. Article 4. Time and place. Liminal hour, fixed star, a chapel that exists only when needed, and then folds back into walls that pretend they were always there. The geometry is not magic, it is routine. You need a pattern when you intend to move the hinges of habit. Article 5. Transference. The clause draws itself up like a clerk at a window. The soul is not moved. The account of the soul is reassigned. The face remains. The remembered face is redistributed. The self continues. The public self changes address. The world receives new mail without complaint. Article 6 Counterpledge. A sigil in an angel's name, drawn in architecture rather than letters, pressed in wax that refuses to age. The seal is not a blessing. It is a lock that looks like a halo. It is one thing to read such things once and feel your stomach protest like a child kept too long from meals. It is another to read them twice and feel your hands go steady. The steadying terrified me. Competence is how evil keeps its shoes clean. I turned from the articles to the smaller book. The clerk's case notes the thin palm-sized ledger of lives, adjusted into obedience. I read the scholar's entry again, then the artist's, then a third I had not noticed. A woman who had taught children to draw maps that included paths not yet taken, and therefore had taught them to desire futures not yet scheduled. Her ledger assignment reduced her to a pious aunt whom nephews visit on Sundays. The line recording the exchange was almost apologetic. Excess of influence on immature minds. I felt the lantern cool and wondered whether metal can be disgusted. The ledger of faces, the little index I had stolen, burned against my chest with a thin heat like shame pretending to be truth. I set it beside the articles and compared numbers the way a boy compares coins he thinks are his to coins he suspects are not. The matches were too neat to be coincidences, and too bland to be art. This was not an occult. It was an office. On the underside of the articles, in the slanting glass hand of the threader, ran a commentary disguised as courtesy. We do not erase. We redistribute. A good lie knows that cruelty sounds kinder when you hire it to do administration. Why keep such papers at all? Why not burn what embarrasses you and file only what you can defend to the dead? The answer lives in every bureaucracy. Without paper, power forgets itself. A ledger is a mirror that congratulates. They kept these documents because accuracy is the throne on which authority sits, and the articles allowed them to call their audacity accurate. I want to be fair. This is the thing requiring the most effort. To extend fairness to men who trained fairness to heal. The articles had margins crowded with justifications. They spoke of peace, of unity, of the violent mercy of removing the burden of singularity from those who could not carry it safely. They insisted that dangerous minds do their greatest harm not through ideas, but through recognition, through the untidy multiplication that occurs when one face teaches another to look beyond the fence. Correct the recognition, the margins advised, and the ideas will learn to starve. In the kinder notes, written by a clerk who could not entirely forget being a person, I found phrases like, "This will spare him prison. This will spare her flames. This will let their children keep a father who will now be gentle." The mercy made my mouth salt with anger it would later call grief. On a lower shelf, I discovered the section I had dreaded and desired in equal measure. The procedural manuals. There are few objects more obscene than a manual for doing harm efficiently while praying over the process. I have seen such books in other rooms. Instructions for constructing cages that do not leave marks, memos about how to phrase decisions so that the condemned will thank you for your time. Here the manuals concerned recognition management. The titles were mild to the point of parody. On harmonizing accounts, on rectifying divergent witness, a short discourse on the civic health of remembering less. One booklet, slim and bound in something that had once been white but had compromised itself to gray, offered examples for training novice clerks of the Micro-Canon. It used the language of shepherding. It used, often, the word soothing. The examples were small, because evil learns itself on goats before it graduates to flocks. A professor whose students repeat him too perfectly. Solution: reassign his ledger to an older man who tells jokes. The ideas will become charming and then evaporate. A midwife who records more deaths than births because she has learned to count correctly in a district addicted to miracles. Solution: reassign her ledger to a woman whose hands distract. Make her a cousin whose stew is everyone's favorite. The statistics will improve. The babies will not. There was a paragraph on temporal stitching, the technique by which adjacent years are sewn to new neighbors so that causation forgets which door it used to knock on. The sentence about calendars detached itself from the page and stood in the room. When the sky offends the arithmetic of crowns, correct the sky by correcting the book that records it. I heard in that sentence the sound of centuries knitting themselves to fit a desired sleeve. I had once admired the Gregorian reform the way a boy admires a clean table, everything set straight, no crumbs of drift, the moon finally agreeing to sit where told. Now I understood that even cleanliness can be a weapon when you apply it to the wrong hunger. The manuals did not mention the word soul, except as a legal constant. The soul, they assured the reader, was not harmed, not moved, not even jostled, only its paperwork was improved. The cruelty of that assurance is mathematical. If you deny injury to the interior, you will never apologize for ruin done to the exterior, and men live most of the time outside themselves. I wrote in my own margin a sentence that I have tried to erase many times and failed. If the book that governs recognition is holy, then holiness is an index. Somewhere above us, a bell tested the hour, slightly off from the clock in the hallway, which was slightly off from the sky, which was precisely aligned with nothing men had made. I closed the manuals and let the silence resume its office. When silence is compelled for too long, it begins to breathe through its teeth. I did not want the room to begin hissing at me. The copyist's room, the one without air, where iron gall ink tries its best to become weather, waited 2 corridors away like a witness who has sworn to tell the truth and has learned to tell it in pen nib widths. I went to them because reading law without watching craftsmen practice it is a recipe for arrogance. There is a difference between outrage and understanding, and one of them is useful. The room was inhabited by patience. The women and men there wore shawls the color of moths, so that any fallen fiber on a page would be discovered at once. They did not look up when I entered. Looking up is for rooms where time smiles. Their hands ticked, and the ticking was a kindness to the paper. The woman who had once told me where phantom time sleeps nodded toward a map pinned to the wall with pins black from old fingerprints. It was not a map of days. It was a map of weight, a relief of history's mass. Centuries were valleys or iron ridges. Each correction added a sliver here, shaved a sliver there, until causation felt inevitable. Why not burn it? I asked her, breaking the vow of a visitor. Do not make the work pause to teach you how to respect it. She did not stop writing. You cannot burn a river, she said. You can only dig it new banks. She tapped the parchment with the back of her pen. We build banks. I watched the man at the next table participate in a ritual I had not known existed, the dilution of a name. He copied an account of a minor feast day and smuggled into the lines a surname belonging to a man who, in truth, had discovered something embarrassing about a relic. He did not slander the man. He did not lie. He distributed him. By the end of the page, the name had become a common river stone, unremarkable, appearing naturally in many streams. The man would now be difficult to find because he was everywhere. "Isn't this lying?" I asked, the way a child asks a question he knows will annoy. The moth-colored woman answered by making a small correction that improved the alignment of a page with its margin. "We correct for turbulence," she said. "People imagine history as a procession. It is a weather system. We smooth the winds that topple the weak. The weak," I said, "should learn to lean. Rememberation. She looked up then, not with anger, which would have given me comfort, but with the slow sorrow of a mason who hears a visitor call the wall a painting. "You are thinking about virtue," she said softly. "We are forced to think about structure." She went back to her line work. "Virtue breaks if you do not give it an architecture. We are the architecture." I wanted to tell her that architecture is what tyrants build when they are bored with parades. I wanted to tell her that virtue grows like vines and does not require stone to be faithful. Instead, I asked for the training. She allowed me to read the novice's primer. It was a catechism without God because it worshipped predictability. What is a witness? A witness is a book that is loved for being boring. What is a correction? A correction is a kindness done to a violent narrative. What is memory? Memory is a choir that sings in unison or it ceases to be heard. What is dissent? Dissent is a melody that must be transposed until it agrees. I have taught boys to sing. I know what happens to a melody you force into the wrong key. It becomes accurate and untrue. There was a lesson on faces that hooked in the mind like a fishbone. It instructed the novice to practice noticing not beauty, not deformity, not charm, but repeatable signatures. The way a man nods when he does not understand. The seam that relief draws between the eyes of a woman who has just learned mercy is delayed. The laugh that tastes of iron because a tooth is cracked, and pride insists on pretending otherwise. Catalog these, the lesson said, and you can port a person from one ledger to another without causing nausea in the witnesses. The world dislikes nausea. It will agree with whatever prevents it. Who trained you? I asked the woman. Not because I thought the name would help me, but because curiosity is a muscle and I needed mine not to atrophy. My mother, she said matter-of-factly. She corrected hymns in a province that preferred storms to crops. Is she still alive? She was redistributed, the woman said, and dipped her pen. In the corner, a young man arranged a stack of atlases, the way a pharmacist arranges bottles. He was new enough to still be in love with the smell of what would break him. He had ink on his lip and didn't know, he murmured, to no one and to the page. We are making it gentle. I recognized in him an earlier version of myself, the boy who thought that a tidy shelf is a moral achievement. There is a temptation, when you discover a hidden machinery, to believe that your anger can jam the gears. Anger is too soft for that. What jams gears is grit. What breaks them is sand. I had no sand to throw. I had only notes and a small room inside me, where disgust had taken a chair and insisted on staying decent. On the walk back to the lower room, I felt the building breathe. Old buildings breathe honestly. their walls flex like ribs, their floors take the weight of your unbelief and make of it a rhythm. I set the manuals back as I had found them, though no one would have noticed if I had rearranged their spines to spell a message only I could read. I sat at the little desk and spread the index of faces beside the articles and the thin case ledger until the three objects made a triangle that felt, briefly, like prayer. It is time to tell you what the Micro-Canon is in the simplest possible grammar, so that, when you begin to do your own remembering, you will have a tool and not only a story. The Micro-Canon is a set of rules footnotes dressed as commandments that govern the administration of recognition. It declares that the soul is constant, and that therefore the only honorable arena for control is memory. It provides procedures for reassigning the world's greeting to a person without injuring, and therefore without having to mourn, the person himself. It enforces the fiction that public life is a matter of indexing and private life, a matter of indifference. It is not a religion. It is the habit that a religion grows when it prefers order to truth. It is not a conspiracy. It is the committee minutes of power doing what it believes is merciful. If you have ever lost a friend not to death but to a sudden accuracy, if he returned from a season of influence, speaking in sentences that lock rather than open, if she woke one morning committed to the comforts of a narrative that sets every plate exactly where a reasonable host would set it if they smiled, and you felt your face learn a new way to smile back without consent, then you have witnessed the Micro-Canon distribute a self. I closed the triangle of books, and as I did, the lantern breathed out again that little sigh of warmed metal. I tucked the index into my robe and the case ledger with it, and left the articles where they belonged because theft has to be rationed if it is to be useful. On the way out, I noticed for the first time a notice thumbtacked to the inside of the door where your eyes would never rest unless you opened the room. On Wednesdays, do not breathe too loudly. It made me smile the way a scar does when weather changes. Rules disguise themselves as jokes, so that breaking them feels like a failure of humor. I locked the door. The brass ring kissed the iron plate with a small, satisfied sound, and the stairwell delivered me upward like mail. In the library proper, a boy was waiting at my desk with a question about a saint's calendar whose feast day had been moved and moved again until even the devout thought the date had always lived where it now lived. He was outraged in the comfortable way. Students are outraged when their discoveries are printed in the front matter of older books. I taught him how to read the errata. I told him that corrections do not necessarily equal conspiracies. I believed the first half of that sentence. He left satisfied, and I tried not to throw up into the gentle, useful tray where we keep request slips. That night the bells harmonized correctly with the sky and the clocks, and the thin click in the wall that governed the lower room's balance. I ate bread that remembered the warmth of the oven faithfully. I said good night to men I love, because we have tried to love one another, even while serving, like sleepwalkers, a house that can be proud of training love to obey. I went to my cell and cleaned my nails of ink, and asked the God who trains himself to listen whether the act of listening to me made him complicit. I received no answer, which is either mercy or policy. I dreamed of the copyist's map, the relief of centuries, and in the dream I pressed a thumb into a thin century until it became thick enough to support a bridge. I woke with my thumb aching and the certain knowledge that my recognition was already being handled. If you look closely at a man who suspects he has become a ledger entry, you will see two faces, the one he holds still for you, and the one he watches in the reflection of your pupils. I had become that sort of two-faced creature, not a liar, precisely, but a steward of two simultaneous truths, the one the books wanted, and the one the room below had shown me. It is inconvenient to live. It is more inconvenient to remember. The Micro-Canon thrives on our preference for convenience. I tell you now, before we go any deeper, that there will come a point soon when the rules will ask for my cooperation not as a librarian but as a witness. They will need my neat hand to make their mercy believable. They will need my breath to keep the pages gentle. I will fail them. I will not fail elegantly, but I will fail them. Before the day that demands that failure arrived, there was a lesson I had to learn so that my anger would not waste itself in noise. The lesson was simple enough to stitch into a sleeve. The only hinge the Micro-Canon cannot oil is the hinge between two people who agree to remember each other inconveniently. Paper is strong, ledgers are loud, but two witnesses who refuse the redistribution, who carry in their faces the older greeting, can ruin a very tidy office. I would not know that for certain until the night of the exchange. For now, this is what I knew, as I blew out the candle and lay down in a cell that pretended to be humble so the building could believe in itself. The Micro-Canon is not a ghost, it is a grammar. It writes the world by rearranging who you are allowed to be when others look at you. It changes nothing but memory, which is to say, it changes everything you can hold. If you are drowsy, that is all right. Stories for sleep are not lullabies, they are keys disguised as whispers. Keep this key under your tongue and dream with it there. When they say nothing changes except memory, teach your memory to be disobedient. Keep one another honest by refusing to agree too quickly. If there is a ledger, become its error. And if you need a prayer because you cannot fall asleep without one, use mine. I have not learned to hate it yet. Let me be a ruin that remembers, and let those I love memorize the shape of my ruin, so that if I am redistributed, they will build me back by breath alone. I have already told you about the room that never admits air, how the copyists there write in iron gall that stains the fingers like a polite wound. But I did not tell you what it feels like to be taught by them, to have your mind sharpened on their patience until you can feel the sliver of history the way a stonemason feels the grain of marble. I did not tell you how they train the eyes to see witness drift that slow, almost tender migration of recognition by which a person is moved, not from life to death, but from meaning to habit. The morning I asked to learn, the moth-colored woman gave me a place at a narrow table near the wall. There is mercy in sitting near the wall. No one passes behind you with a shadow that asks your nerves for permission. She set an inkwell by my hand and a knife for trimming quills. The knife was not sharp, it was disciplined. A sharp knife makes mistakes quickly. A disciplined one gives the wood time to confess. Begin with faces, she said, and placed a folio before me whose vellum had become as soft as certainty. Not portraits, signatures. On each page a face had been described without adjectives, as if God had made a lexicon for angels who cannot be tempted by adjectives. Left eye slightly earlier to joy than right. Lips drink vowels before releasing them. Forehead remembers the hat it has not worn in 20 years. Under each description, a line waited for a number. Ledger assignment. The numbers were in a neat column in a book across the table. My task was to read the face description, then decide which ledger would allow the world to greet that face without nausea while gently reassigning its power. "This is not lying," the woman said without looking at me, reading the resistance in my shoulders the way one reads a weather vane in a wind that has not yet arrived. "This is harmonizing." "Why not call it what it is?" I asked. "A hymn in a key the singer did not choose." "Because we do not sing," she said. "We bind. In I every two. There's unter. In I. There is a cruelty particular to work done well. The better I got at the exercise, the more I hated my hands. I began to recognize the repeatable signatures that the primer had praised, the way a man mishears the name of his father on purpose, the way a woman's eyelids accept fear but refuse its rhythm, the way a child apologizes with the neck before the mouth has learned syntax. These things can be indexed. They can be reconciled across ledgers so that the world can be taught to say, "Ah, yes, that is him," even when him has been gently resigned to a different history. Accuracy can become blasphemy when it kneels to the wrong altar. "Now the second exercise," the woman said after an hour that had shaved itself into minutes without my consent. She placed before me 2 short accounts of a minor feast day from different regions, one written in a stiff clerical hand, the other copied by a parish teacher who loved margins as if they were gardens. The names within the accounts did not match. In the first, a farmer's surname had hardened into a title. In the second, the same man's name had thinned until it was almost weather. My task was to dilute him, redistribute his occurrence until the ledger would stop clustering around him, like bees around a scandal. "Why him?" I asked. "Because his daughter found a relic that should not have bled," she said, dipping her pen. "We prefer relics that bleed on schedule." I worked the name into other records, careful, respectful, never slanderous, letting it appear where it would make sense to a reader with a shopping list to finish. By the end, the farmer was everywhere, and therefore nowhere. He had become a kind of punctuation, present, necessary, forgettable. I put down the pen and felt the skin at my wrists tighten, as if my body were trying to keep me from leaving myself. Across the room, a young copyist, the boy with ink on his lip, practiced temporal stitching under the supervision of the old man whose hands shook only when he lifted a cup of water. The boy traced a seam between 2 years that had never been neighbors, humming to himself a lullaby for calendars. He looked so proud when the line lay flat that I hated him briefly and forgave him at once. There are forms of innocence that are only rehearsal for guilt. The moth-colored woman must have seen my face arrange itself into something rude, because she said, "We have a right for that." She took me to a side alcove where a small choir practiced the binding harmonies I had seen footnoted in the manuals, the so-called warded choir. Their voices tuned not to melody but to correction. Each pitch they held had been calculated from star tables that I had always believed were reserved for astronomers and sailors. The table here was inscribed with an angelic sigil I had drawn the night before, only now the curves moved like the shadow of a machine. "What are they doing?" I whispered. "Teaching a room to agree," she said. "We do it in chapels before exchanges. Stones remember, but they do not remember quickly. The choir helps. The sound had no beauty I could praise without lying. It was not ugly. It was exact. I felt in my teeth an invitation to stop resisting the order of things and to let the world become a ledger with smooth pages. I have loved music all my life. I have watched hymns repair grief for the space of one breath. This music did not repair. It replaced. When the choir finished, the director, a man whose hair had memorized the discipline of water, bowed slightly to the sigil, as if apologizing for using it like a tool. "We will need you tomorrow night," he said to me in a voice without accusation. "Bring your neat hand." "Need me for what?" I asked, though the answer was already standing behind me like a polite usher. "For witness alignment," he said, and left me to rehearse my panic in private. I returned to the tables to find the copyists engaged in a practice I did not yet have words for. They called it baptizing science. One woman adjusted the phrasing in a treatise on optics so that the description of light through a lens could be shelved without scandal near the catalogue of candles said to have burned without end. She did not lie about the lens. She did not deny that the candles ever burned. She merely wove the accounts into a braid tight enough that the eye would take obedience for evidence. "We do not kill curiosity," she said when she saw me watching. "We convert it. There is not of the palm." In fact, on a side table lay a lopsided contraption of brass and bone and thread. It looked like a child's sculpture of an idea. "Clockwork angel," the boy said, following my gaze. "Maintenance manuals on the shelf." The manual written in that same glass hand that could have cut fingers described how to stabilize the gears so that the wings would rise and fall at the cadence of a collect. It was clever, honest, useful. It hurt me more than any fever. Miracles should either be miracles or not, I told myself, and hated how childish it sounded in a room where competence had sanctified itself. In the afternoon, a middle-aged man with a mouth that squinted brought a portfolio that, he said, required emergency harmonization. Inside, a set of maps, not of land, but of memory pathways. Each showed how a single name branched in different minds, where the branches had been pruned, where they had been grafted, where two minds shared a riverbank. He laid one map beside the index of faces and asked, like a teacher cautious with a promising student, "What do you see?" "Storm damage," I said, before my piety could intervene, "and channels dredged so that the flood will go where you prefer." He allowed himself a small satisfaction that made him look briefly like a father. "Good. Now, where would you dig if you hope to save the garden on the east side without letting the orchard on the west drown?" It was obscene to be asked to help. It was also irresistible to a mind like mine, tuned for problem sets and the good ache of precision. I told him which channels to widen, which to let silt. He nodded, and his quill moved with a humility that hid its triumph. I cleaned my pen nib as if I could wash off the usefulness. "Come," the moth-colored woman said, touching my sleeve with a pressure that knew I would follow. "See something we do not show visitors." She led me to a narrow passage at the back of the room, where stones leaned in as if gossiping. The passage opened into a catacomb index, not of bones, but of books. Each niche held a volume that did not want to be seen. On their spines, no titles, only weathering. A band of darker leather where fingers had learned to remember. She took down a volume that smelled faintly, impossibly, of salt water, and laid it open, inside. Chains. Not real, drawn in ink so dark it absorbed light. Beneath the chains, a title, "On Saints Removed from the Calendar for Their Own Safety." I read the names, those careful, gentle erasures, men and women whose stories had taught too well, whose feast days had made inconvenient memories gather like pilgrims with good shoes. Each entry ended with the phrase, redistributed to local devotions. I closed the book because something in my chest was beginning to breathe in a way that would make me foolish. "We did not kill them," she said, almost kindly. "We hid them where kindness could still find them." "Kindness has poor eyesight when policy is in the room," I said, and immediately regretted the rudeness. She did not scold me. "You must decide whether you mean to be angry as a luxury or as a craft," she said. "Anger as luxury makes speeches. Anger as craft makes tools." She slid the chained book back into its niche with the respect one gives a relic that did too much good and was therefore retired. On our way out, we passed a gilded reliquary that had been made honest on the inside. A note in the bottom, hidden beneath the velvet, explaining the mechanism that allowed the gold to weep on command. The note was not an apology. It was a maintenance schedule. The reliquary would weep at first vespers and major feasts, and the wick in the hidden vessel must be replaced on the calends of each month. There are days when the difference between theater and sacrament is only the honesty of your stage manager. Back at my wall table, I found a folded sheet with my name not written on it and my attendance warmly assumed. Inside, a summons to the packed scriptorium for the following night at midnight under Regulus. The line that had rearranged my life sat gleaming at the center as if this were all an invitation to a dance. Nihil mutatur nisi memoria. I held the paper long enough that my thumb left a small, clear place in the dust, a tidy oval like an eye that had watched a little too hard. I tell you this so you will not imagine me a hero walking deliberately toward crisis. I considered tearing the summons. I considered igniting it over the lantern like a peasant in a story told to frighten children into not touching fences. I considered hiding in obedience, the way you hide a body in river mud, close, without ceremony, counting on the water to be your accomplice. But water remembers boats, and obedience remembers rooms you should not have entered. The remaining hours of that day learned to behave like days. I copied a charter from the reign of a king whose historians had agreed not to mention that he believed he was an owl for 6 weeks every spring. I answered a letter from a scholar who wanted to know whether the library held a map of Jerusalem that placed certain gates closer to each other than reality permits. I wrote him a pleasant falsehood that kept his grant safe and his children in shoes. I watched a novice vow to the stacks, as if marrying the idea of keeping. At vespers I sat in a pew behind a man whose prayer had the sincerity of a hand learning a complicated knot. The choir above sang beauty, not correction. The beauty did not make me forgive the warded choir their skill, but it did make me ashamed of having begrudged the world its useful songs. I asked God for a small favor. He has denied me most of my life, to let me be simple for 1 hour. He refused. Or perhaps I refused him. There are refusals that happen in both directions at once, and leave everyone thinking they were generous. After nightfall, I returned to the copyist's room, not to work, but to watch the closing rite. They do not extinguish lamps all at once. They lower the wicks in order, from newest to oldest flame, so that the room can remember its history in the correct direction. The last lamp to dim is the one the threader once used, the one whose smoke has trained itself to rise in a straight line. When it surrendered its light, the darkness did not pounce. It negotiated. I heard, in that negotiation, the logic of the Micro-Canon. Let nothing change except memory. Darkness is not the opposite of light. it is its administrator. On my way back to the cell, a figure stopped me in the corridor, old, sexless. At first glance, the way age becomes itself, then suddenly, insistently, female. When the lamp slid across her features and found a mouth that held patience like a coin. "You are the librarian," she said in a tone that measured me more kindly than any scale would have. "Bring a clean pen tomorrow, and do not eat before midnight. Hunger keeps the hand honest." "Honest to whom?" I said, before my prudence could pull me by the ear. "To the page," she said, and was gone with the economy of someone who has learned to walk without leaving footprints in corridors that remember. I could not sleep. Sleep is a ledger balanced by forgiveness. My columns had been penciled over by too many hands. I laid the index of faces on the blanket and read entries at random until the faces belonged not to people I knew but to gestures I recognized. The habit of pulling the ear when lying politely, the small backward step, the modest take before saying something brave. The way grief stands in the jaw like a sentry who has been told to let joy through, but to make it show papers first. After each description, the number. After the number, the certainty that nothing would change except memory. I closed the book and pressed it to my chest, the way a man presses a letter from a country that no longer exists. Just before the bell for matins, someone slid a second note under my door. No summon this time. A warning written in a hand I had not seen in any ledger. When the ledger asks for your breath, remember that breath is a witness too. The book does not count the sighs it collects. The room does. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. I blessed the anonymous courage the way one blesses a child you will never meet. Too late, too little, but better than the silence I had otherwise to offer. At midnight, Regulus, steady and unembarrassed, the packed scriptorium would open its door to a witness whose neat hand had won him the courtesy of entering the machinery without bowing. Before that hour, there remained a lesson the copyists wanted me to not forget, that the architecture of remembering is built with tools that do not look like power while they are in your palm. A pen, a wick, a choir that sings in keys the body recognizes before the mind agrees. I went once more to the wall table and sat like a man at a train station deciding whether the next train is a rescue or a theft. I trimmed a quill in the disciplined manner the knife preferred. I wrote a sentence on a scrap in my own hand, the hand I now mistrusted, because rooms had praised it so that later I would not be able to accuse myself of not knowing. If they move memory, move witness. If they ask for your breath, learn how to breathe against the page. There are alphabets that the obedient cannot read. I resolved to learn one. When I blew out the candle, the smoke rose in a straight line, as if reluctant to meet the ceiling. Silence settled with its usual grace, the kind that makes men call it sanctity, when in fact it is only peace obeying a schedule. I lay down, and the building did what buildings do to those who have confessed to them. It held me without opinion. I will not pretend that courage slept beside me. Courage is a luxury in a house that trains virtues to become administrators. What slept was a different companion, older, hungrier, less dignified. Stubbornness. Stubbornness is what remains when you subtract good intentions from a man and leave him with only his refusal to be taught what is easy. It is an ugly virtue. It is also a hinge the Micro-Canon does not oil well. When I woke to the bell that said the night had ripened enough to be shared with witnesses, I dressed carefully, as if clothing could teach a body to behave. I took the clean pen. I did not eat. Hunger, I discovered, makes your hand refuse shortcuts. The corridor smelled of stone, having remembered again that it used to be pressure. The library exhaled, accepting that it would lend itself to a ceremony it had been built to host but had never been introduced to by name. And below, beyond the jokes that scold your breathing, the copyists prepared their maps and their chains and their gentle, competent songs. They had trained me well. They had taught me to call cruelty structure, to call theft redistribution, to call singing correction, to call obedience a virtue that paper prefers. I carried all those names with me like tools I would use until they broke in my hand and cut me cleanly enough to convince me I was awake. The packed scriptorium waited with its seals and its ribbons and its balance that refuses to be embarrassed. Once, I would have paused to pray. Now I paused to remember faces, gestures, the signatures of souls that offices had decided to number. I whispered the names of the saints redistributed to local devotions, not because I thought they would protect me, but because names are nails. Memory hangs its coat on them. If nothing changes except memory, then nails are weapons. The copyists had done their work. The ledgers were aligned. The choir had tuned the room to agreement. The clock above the hall checked itself against the sky and nodded. The hinge in the door to the scriptorium had been oiled with something that smelled like almonds. The seal wax sat in a shallow dish like a tame sundae. A chair waited for my neat hand. "Witness," the director said softly, greeting me by office, not by name, because offices cannot be redistributed without ceremony, and names can. "I am here," I said, not to him but to the page. Silence arranged itself, quite beautifully, across the room. And for the first time since I had opened the door with the ring that sweats salt, I understood a piece of mercy buried like a seed in this cruelty. If memory is their instrument, then memory is also our asylum. A thing that can be administered can also be refused. Not politely, not without cost, but refused. "Begin," someone said. I set the pen to paper. Hunger steadied my breath, and from the catacombs, the rooms without air, where hands make weather, I carried into the scriptorium, a craft I had not owned yesterday, the ability to watch a sentence, try to be harmless, and to remember it dangerous. Silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. But there are moments rare, absurd when enforcement forgets to count, and a single witness writes as if his ink had learned how to bite back. I wrote. Midnight arrived without ceremony, the way a verdict arrives when all the arguments have taught themselves to dress alike. Regulus held his small, unwavering place above Rome, and beneath him a door that had never needed to introduce itself, loosened its breath, and allowed men inside. They did not call it a sanctuary. They did not call it a court. They called it what it was, the packed scriptorium, a shrine to paperwork so thorough it could afford to be modest. You would not have picked it, walking past, unless your eyes had been trained to read dust as a liturgy. The dust here did not simply fall. It cued. The room observed me the way a ledger observes the name you are about to write, without malice, without favor, with the calm that power borrows from furniture. Ribbons slept on a table, coiled like patient creatures. Seals lounged in their dishes with a confidence that comes only to objects that have always gotten their way. A long balance stood upon a stone plinth, its arms so precise they refused drama. One pan held a wax cylinder stamped with an angel's hinge name. The other pan held the memory of having held something important and the posture that such memory gives. Above, a single lamp burned with a steady flame, trained by years of witnessing men grow cautious. "Witness," the director said. He had the voice of a mason, no flourishes, all weight. "Your hand." I showed him the clean pen and the hunger that had not yet forgiven me for being pious on its behalf. "Good," he said. "Hunger refuses shortcuts. Shortcuts are where the worst lies learn to put on shoes." They led me to the table where the principal ledger lay open to the first of the Micro-Canon's operative forms, M12, De Permutatione Animarum. The text did not posture, it did not blink. Let nothing change except memory. The line sat in the center of the page, as placidly as a pond that has swallowed a village. "Begin with concordance," said the director, nodding toward 3 lesser ledgers, triangulated like instruments on a ship's bridge. "Align the witness book to the parish registers, then to the civil indices. Names first, then faces, then behaviors that read as character to the unwary." He turned and addressed, with equal politeness, the stones. "Choir, choir." From the gallery above, the warded choir released sound like the thought of a ruler. It did not rise, it prescribed. The intervals were calculated on a sheet pinned to the wall, star tables reduced to numbers that even a tired clerk could trust at the hour when doubt looks like devotion. I felt the tuning change the air, not like perfume, not like weather, like policy. The hair on my wrist learned to salute without being asked. I laid my palm flat on the table and decided to breathe as I had taught myself in the catacombs, against the page, not through it. "Read," said the director. I read. The supplicant's name was recorded in the holy way, baptismal, unarguable. Beneath it, a second name stood in careful, secular print, the public self, the name that friends lean on. Beside both names, the index numbers the copyists had taught me to fear. The numbers matched nothing that would comfort anyone. "Object of transference?" the clerk at my left asked, dipping his pen. "Ledger of recognition," I said. "Public greeting, social echo. All subsequent instances of the face in civic and ecclesial registers." I hated myself for how competently the sentences walked out of my mouth. "In consideration?" he said, perfectly bored. "Memoria solvenda," I answered. "Memories to be held in escrow until due." The Latin resisted drama. It congratulated procedure. A door at the far end released 2 figures who did not bother to look at me because tonight had nothing to do with the gossip of witnesses. The first was the custodial official, wearing, not vestments, but the office itself, small, exact, tidy as a clause. The second was the supplicant, the scholar I had read about in the case notes, the man whose proof had caused calendars to blink, whose handwriting had taught numbers to acknowledge they were servants and not kings. He looked like a man who had lost a son and kept the house clean so the news could not accuse him. They did not ask him to kneel. Kneeling is for rituals that admit they are rituals. The exchange is administrative. The scholar stood before the balance. He did not look at the seal. He looked at the empty pan. It is a terrible thing to see intelligence educate itself to obedience. "I am here," he said softly, in a voice that had dutifully learned smallness. He could have refused. It is important to write that sentence, even if it will be erased by men who have learned how to wash ink from the future. He could have refused, and they would have called his refusal a disorder of temperament, a spiritual inflation, an uncollegial posture toward the common good. He could have refused and been punished in a way the world recognizes as honest injury, but he had already taught himself to love the idea of sparing others. Mercy can be a leash when it is tightened by the wrong hands. Articles, the director said. I read them aloud. Article 1, Parties. Article 2, Consideration. Article 3, Witness. Article 4, Time and Place. Article 5, Transference. Article 5, 6, Counterpledge. They sounded strangely like safety instructions on a ship that has always sunk on schedule. The choir adjusted the room's breath by a fraction of a pitch. It felt like a coin placed on the tongue of a corpse to pay the ferryman. The corpse, to be precise, was recognition. Scribe, said the director, addressing me without turning his head. Hand. I signed where the form demanded the witness's neat name, and then, next to the line where a witness's breath is to be recorded, I did the small treachery I had promised myself in the catacombs. I exhaled to the side, letting the air slide past the page rather than onto it, a childish defiance perhaps. But breath is a witness. The book does not count the sighs it fails to collect. The room does. I wanted the room to remember a refusal, even if the record would call it a draft. The scholar spoke his part as if repeating an old catechism whose theology he has learned to dislike, but whose rhythm still comforts. I consent to the reassignment of my ledger. Let nothing change except memory. Let them remember me less, where remembering me harms the common peace. Let them remember me more, where remembering me harms nothing. Every sentence ended as if he were setting down a porcelain cup and did not wish it to clink. Counter pledge, the clerk to my left intoned. He held up the little dish of cooling wax. The hinge-named sigil rested like a quiet trap. The custodian pressed the seal with a care that made the motion seem pious. A serenity bloomed in the wax the way breath blooms on glass. No wonder this process tempts good men. It is beautiful. Balance, the director said. The clerk to my right placed the sealed wafer on the empty pan. The arm of the scale moved as if taking attendance. A shadow along the wall adjusted itself by the width of a decision. In the gallery, the choir shifted to a subharmonic cadence called witness alignment chords that teach a room to stop preferring its memories out of order. The stones listened as bravely as stone can. The scholar's mouth moved without words, the universal liturgy of someone who is rehearsing grief in a key that will not alarm his children. Proceed, said the director. The procedure has no candles to blow, no wine to sip, no smoke to sweeten the unruly present toward sacrifice. It has clauses. It has boxes. It has the small ecstasies of check marks, perfectly aligned in a hand that confuses accuracy with justice. I wrote quickly and slowly at once, handwriting that understands the cost of neatness. The custodian recited the cross-references like a rosary, registers in Rome, registers in Bologna, registers in Paris, registers in the little college where the scholar had once told boys that truth is the only animal that will not live in a cage. The boys will remember a teacher who taught generosity, not defiance. The cage will feel like furniture. From a cabinet beside the balance, a clerk drew out the replacement ledger, not a blank book, never a blank book, but a volume preloaded with harmlessness. Its spine had learned to stay modest on a shelf. The custodian opened it to the first page and wrote, in the same glass hand that had threaded the commentaries in the catacombs, the scholar's baptismal name. Under it, In neat, civic script, he wrote the new public name that would agree more quietly with the narrow corridors through which a respectable life must be moved. He did not lie. He wrote the truth that would be permitted. "Anchoring memory," said the director. The choir changed again, lower still, a tone like the hum in a ship when everyone is trying to sleep and the ocean has forgiven gravity its rudeness. A junior clerk, trained by manuals I had grown to despise for how well they taught love to behave, stepped forward with the concordance slate, a board of thin beaten lead on which significant witnesses' names had been incised. He placed it beneath the balance, so that the scale's motion would press a tiny change into the metal. Pressed words are obedient words. They have learned the price of appearing. "Review," said the director. I read back, like a child reciting, the critical data star, hour, registrar, clerk, seal, clause, witness, ledger numbers, cross-indexed shelf marks, and the sigil's full angelic grammar, which I will not repeat because names are not decorations. As I read, the scholar's shoulders did something I had seen soldiers' shoulders do in fields where no one had expected to need altars. They set down the last parcel they meant to carry and stood there empty-handed, amazed at how light a man can feel when he agrees to be smaller. "Any objection?" the custodian asked with the kind voice of a surgeon who has learned bedside manners from a good, practical priest. The scholar made a sound I had heard once before in the cell of a man who knew he would die without letting anyone else tidy up his courage. It was not a sob. It was not a laugh. It was a human noise that failed to qualify for vocabulary, and therefore had no ledger. For a moment, one small, real moment, the room forgot itself. The choir faltered by a hair's breadth, and the balance acknowledged, without moving, that grief had a weight paper cannot measure. Then competence reclaimed its shoes, and the ceremony continued. "Witness," the director said to me again. "Margin." I knew this part from the manuals. A ceremony is not complete until a contrary hand supplies the margin of conscience, a little space where the witness may register inconvenience. The space is performative. It protects the book from claims that it has bullied everyone into linearity. 99 times out of 100, the margin holds a sentence like, "all in accord with the common peace." This time, my hand wrote small, neat, neutral, easily missed, exactly placed where even a hasty clerk will feel compelled to read aloud when auditing silence is enforced. Witness present, ledger moved. Memory refuses full compliance. It was not a heroic line. It was a stone placed where someone will one day stub his foot. "Seal," said the director. The custodian affixed the second seal, the one that binds the new ledger to the witness book, so that all future concordances will find the path of least resistance. The wax shone like a word that enjoys being uttered. The choir laid their final tone across the room like a blanket that will never permit rest to be unruly again. The scholar stood as a man stands when a long fever has decided to become his temperature. "Finished," the clerk to my left said, and his pen relaxed in the fingers the way a man's face relaxes when his duty has taught him to be proud without requiring him to enjoy it. No one applauded. The scriptorium is too honest for applause. The scholar signed the ledger. His signature was precise and small, the kind of hand that knows too much to flourish. He touched the seal without seeming to, the way the faithful touch a relic and call it good manners. He turned, and as he did, the world redistributed him. I could see at the instant when a face the room had known decided to recognize a different history. It did not feel like magic. It felt like the first page of a new index. As he passed me, the scholar paused. He did not disobey. He paused the way a paragraph pauses before a parenthesis. His eyes found mine. Recognition passed between us like a coin you refuse to spend. I do not know whether he saw the index of faces under my robe, or whether he simply recognized my hunger. "You will be tired," he said, barely moving his lips. "They will call it zeal or disillusionment. It is neither. It is the body learning to carry a truth that has stopped pretending to be light." He left the room balanced like a sentence that has decided to end without a period. The choir dismissed their chords. The air relaxed. The stones resumed their ancient task of holding up ceilings without ever being thanked in the minutes. The custodian closed the replacement ledger with a motion so gentle it amounted to affection. The director nodded, satisfied, not triumphant, not smug, just satisfied. As a shepherd is satisfied when the flock has been persuaded to move in a neat line away from a cliff that might have offered them a view. "Record," the director said, and I did. Dates, shelf marks, star position, signatures, seals. A notation that the concordant slate had accepted the impression without resistance. I placed the witness book's ribbon with the piety of a man who knows he is tucking in a weapon and calling it sleep. Only then did a small procession, I had not noticed, bring forward the sacrarium of erasures, a tray of ink scrapers, pumice, and a shallow bowl where cuttings from the pages of prior ledgers had been dissolved into a paste that smelled like almonds and rumors. The custodian touched the paste with 2 fingers and marked, on a separate register, the sites where small, precise corrections would be made over the next fortnight, so that the scholar's former recognitions would fade, not by force, but by convenience. Schedules for casual conversations appearing in faculty lounges. A footnote moved to another footnote, and then digested. An index corrected to reflect that a title was misremembered long ago by a trusted reader and should have been misremembered ever since. "Mercy," the clerk to my left said, not approving, not protesting, merely annotating the evening with a word the room would like to have believed. The director dismissed the choir. He dismissed the custodian. He dismissed me last, because witnesses are always the last to go. We stick like smudges where clean fingers have not the time to polish. On the threshold he stopped me with a hand that had never needed to be heavy. "You kept your breath," he said mildly. "A remark and a question and a courtesy." "I lent it to the room," I said. "It has a better memory than the book." This earned the smallest smile I had seen all night, a human concession offered between 2 machines. "Be careful," he said. "Rooms are sentimental, books are pragmatic. Sentiment is a poor defense against policy." He looked past me, through me, at something behind me that had the shape of belief. "Also," he added, almost kindly, "eat. Hunger ennobles the hand, not the mind." When I stepped back into the corridor, I had the sensation, familiar now, of being reintroduced to the building I had lived in for years, as if it were a stranger worth trusting. The lamplight in the hall looked ordinary again. Ordinary is the decor that catastrophe prefers after it has put away its formal clothes. I walked without hurrying toward the stair that would return me to the floors, where honesty still believes itself to be a virtue requiring no paperwork. Halfway up, I stopped. It was not strategy. It was exhaustion defending its dignity. I leaned against stone that had been loyal longer than governments. I heard, distantly, the warded choir, laughing like tired men who know they have done their jobs too well to need applause. I heard the night. I heard the balance admit, to no one, that it had been moved tonight by more than wax. And I heard I am not proud of this. A small voice that lives only in men who have practiced obedience until it becomes appetite. It was clean. It was merciful. No one burned. No one bled. That voice is the Micro-Canon's favorite hymn. I answered it, not yet aloud, with a sentence I had not known I was waiting to learn. No one bled, because we have taught blood to admire paperwork. Back in my cell, I did not sleep. Sleep is the gentle lie the body tells when the mind wants to be outnumbered by blankets. I set the witness book on the table and copied, for myself, across the back of my hand, the line I had smuggled into the margin. Silence is enforced. Witness present. Ledger moved. Memory refuses full compliance. I wanted it where someone might see it, if my mouth had been trained tonight to forget. Skin is the last paper that learns to disobey. Toward morning, my hunger stopped possessing me and agreed to become again what it had been made for. A reminder that men are animals who made promises to time. I ate bread softened in milk and hated how good it tasted. I washed the pen. I set the ribbons straight in the book. I opened the window to let Regulus free me from the obligation of having used him. The star duties concluded. The sky resumed its politics. You expect a revelation here, a vow, a declaration that I would run or fight or publish or set fires in responsible places. I tell you only what I could tell the lamp without insulting it. I had learned the mechanics. I had learned the how. The why remained the same insult it had always been, dressed tonight in competence and the threat of gentleness. And the what now, that untidy interrogative we assign to men who have moved a hinge and must see what the door was refusing, waited in the corner, patient, amused, resembling uncomfortably my own shadow. Before daylight found the corners and accused them of secrecy, I took the index of faces from its false bottom and slid it inside my robe. The book lay against my ribs like a hostage that has chosen its kidnapper. I whispered to it the only prayer I could trust. If they move memory, I will move witness. It sounded inadequate even to my own ears. Inadequate as the size of every honest promise before it lives a day. On my way to the library, I passed a notice pinned to a cork board. No one reads, because the notices there are tired of trying to be useful. Building maintenance at the east stair. Choir rehearsal moved to the north gallery. Request for the return of a missing book that has not existed officially for 147 years. At the bottom, a slip in the threader's glass hand, as brief as a yawn. On Wednesdays, do not breathe too loudly. I laughed, silently, which is to say, I allowed my body to copy comedy without contradicting the rule. Then, I went in to count the day. We like to pretend that the climax of a story is a loud thing. Often, it is a ledger arriving on time. Often, it is a signature that refuses flourish. The exchange had been clean. The policy had been kind. The mercy had been administrative. I had done the job assigned to the witness. I had placed a nail in the page and called it an aside. Now the world would continue its courteous erasures, and if I wanted to have any right to talk about memory as resistance, I would have to find a way to make refusal reproducible. There is a hinge the Micro-Canon cannot oil. I had felt it when the scholar's eyes found mine, and we exchanged, not comfort, but recognition unredistributed. If there is a technology for that, I have not read it in any manual. It is a craft older than law. It lives in the gait of the human animal when it refuses to be shepherded by sound. By nightfall, the summons would arrive for the next witness alignment, for the next correction, which is the house's word for disobediences that survived as personalities. I would be asked again for my neat hand. I would bring it, but I would also bring what the catacombs had hidden in me, a hunger to place, in margins everyone reads, the kind of sentence that shines like a splinter under skin until even obedient bodies demand it be removed. Silence was not sacred, it was enforced. Tonight, for a breath, enforcement blinked. The room remembered my refusal. The page carried a small wound disguised as punctuation, and somewhere, in a ledger that had promised to behave, a nail waited for the foot that would one day curse it and bless it in the same breath. The Micro-Canon had taught me its grammar. I began, without elegance, to learn how to mispronounce it. There are nights that arrive like verdicts, and nights that arrive like weather. This one did both. The sky had practiced being unremarkable all day, then put on its old uniform at the last minute, Regulus holding himself with the indifferent dignity of a star that has been asked too many times to align with human paperwork. Inside, the library exhaled once, long like a house that has learned the timing of its trespassers and has agreed to be graceful about it. They chose a chapel that is both there and not there. If you were to ask the builders for plans, they would offer you drawings that place a broom closet where the altar stands. I had walked past its wall for years. I had admired that wall. It had a stain shaped like a kneeling dog. The door, when you wanted it, grew from the grain like a regret. The warded choir had tuned the air before we arrived. I could tell by the way my teeth corrected their posture without my consent. To a musician, that would have sounded like competence. To a confessor who has learned where competence sleeps, it sounded like policy. The choir itself was hidden behind a screen that had memorized the angelic sigil I had traced in the catacombs. Its scrollwork turned the curves into leaves so the room could pretend it was ordinary. We were 5. The custodian, the director, 2 clerks whose hands had the anonymity of tools, and me, the witness with the neat hand and the breath that had learned to slip past pages. The 6th, who mattered more than all of us, entered last. He had been a scholar of calendars and kings and the contests between them. He had once announced, with proofs even his enemies praised, that time has been persuaded to wear a livery not cut for it. Tonight, he looked like a man who has agreed to be smaller so that a room full of boys can keep believing in their fathers. He did not look at the altar. There was no altar. There was a table with a balance, a book that had decided not to be blank, a dish of wax with a hinge pressed into it, a slate of lead to take impressions the way water takes Sunday. The custodian inclined his head not a bow, a share of gravity. "Scribe," the director said to me, and the word made my stomach remember hunger. "Open M12. I opened the ledger to the page that pretends to be dull. I read the clause that is a mouthful of anesthesia. Nihil mutitur nisi memoria. Let nothing change except memory. The room agreed with its tuning. A bell somewhere in the building checked the time against the sky and endorsed it. "Name," said the clerk on my left. I recorded the baptismal name, the public name, the minor names, those nicknames that friends use when the bar is loud and grief has been set aside for a night. I wrote them small, clean, obedient. Each letter felt like a request I would be ashamed to grant to my own mother. "Consideration," said the clerk on my right. "Memoria solvenda," I said, and wished Latin were a language that could blush. We had rehearsed the motions so often that when the scholar arrived at the line where his consent should live, I recognized the rhythm of compliance before he spoke. "I consent," he said. The sentence fell like a coin on a table that has learned to pretend it is not counting. There was, at that moment, a tremor you would not have noticed if you had not watched men hide their fear behind paperwork for 20 years. The scholar's mouth arranged itself around a different sentence than agreed to the one we expected. It is indecent to witness that degree of discipline and not admire it. I admired it. Then I resented myself for that admiration, as one resents a friend who can make cruelty seem generous by describing it correctly. "Proceed," the director said. The choir dropped into the octave that moors witnesses, their chord verifying the room like an auditor's stamp. I wrote. The custodian recited cross-references in a voice that made even the city names sound as if they regretted being called upon. Bologna, Paris, Salamanca, a parochial registry in Naples, where a clerk's hand had learned to shake only when he lifted a cup. The lead slate took the delicate pressure of the scale's movement and kept it the way a cheek keeps a slap. The wax received the impression of the hinge name with the contentment of a thing that believes in its own necessity. The scholar stared at the empty pan on the balance until his eyes learned the shape of nothing. In that nothing, I saw his laboratory, his boys, the way he had once explained to me in a hallway that good numbers obey even when they dislike the result, that obedience is not virtue. It is the behavior of truth when we've earned it. I wanted to tell him that I had found a number that intended to put its knee on his neck and call it peace. "Counter pledge," said the clerk on my right, and brought the seal like a doctor brings a vaccine to a child who has been taught to admire the needle. "Witness margin," the director said softly, and placed a finger on the little space the manuals euphemize as conscience. I had rehearsed the sentence for hours, not because I believed sentences can stop machines, but because machines sometimes cough when they inhale grit. Silence is enforced. Witness present. Ledger moved. Memory refuses full compliance. I wrote it small and neat, precise enough that another clerk would be compelled, by the pride of that tribe, to read it aloud during audit. It looked harmless. Useful things often do. The director's eyes touched the margin, then me, then returned to their work. He had the manners of a man who has learned to respect termites. When the wax cooled, a clerk reached for the replacement ledger. It is always heavier than it looks. Soft leather, simple spine, pages pre-printed with lines that tell a life exactly how far it is allowed to travel before it counts as trip. He opened to the first page, and the custodian wrote the baptismal name in that glass hand that can make light feel like marble. "Stop," the scholar said. The word did not echo. It put on felt slippers and walked to the center of the room and sat down. The choir missed a heartbeat. The scale lifted a fraction and reconsidered its posture. The director did not look surprised. The custodian did not look offended. They looked the way doctors look when a patient throws up. And everyone agrees that this is neither revolt nor confession, only biology. "I will sign," the scholar said calmly, almost kindly. But I will not say the sentence the way you have taught me. Let nothing change except memory. I will not say it. I will say, let memory change, and let it be recorded that a man refused this line, and the document insisted on writing it over him. We can accommodate phrasing that eases the conscience, the custodian said evenly, and he had. It was in the manuals. We cannot accommodate a record that indicts the process while requiring it. Then write that I did not say it, the scholar replied, and that you wrote it for me because it is the only grammar your book will accept. The director glanced at me. The glance did not order. It informed, your hand will be my memory. I wrote, supplicant declined to pronounce M12 formula. Formula, entered by custody in service of concordance. There are sentences that act like nails, even when they are small. I imagined a future clerk cursing this phrasing, then copying it carefully because the book had learned to expect its little wounds. Anchoring memory, the director said, and the choir returned to its scheduled mercy. The slate took the pressure again. The wax consented. The ledger's ribbon learned where it would sleep for 50 years. The scholar placed his signature below the words he had not spoken. He wrote small, steady, honest. He had never been more himself. Protocol says the room dismisses the subject without fanfare. The room obeyed, almost. The scholar paused, not in front of the balance, not in front of the seal, but in front of me. You kept something, he said, and in his voice there was no accusation, only the arithmetic that scholars perform on faces. I did not move. The index of faces under my robe lay very still, like a child who believes stillness is invisibility. It doesn't matter what you kept, he said. Only that you keep it in someone else, too. If memory is their instrument, it must become your contagion. He looked past me then, to the place where the choir's notes thinned into air, and learned to sing off-key when a room asks you for pitch. He left like a sentence that has not resolved but has decided to end anyway. The procession of administrative mercy began. You do not see it unless you have trained yourself to smell almonds where almonds should not be. A clerk produced the sacrarium of erasures and dabbed a mark on the register that would be visited tomorrow by a careful knife. Another clerk, using the soft voice that bureaucrats practice when tucking monsters into bed, dictated memos for 3 distant libraries, one to update a card catalog, one to correct a shelf list, one to consolidate duplicate entries in a scholar's correspondence. Every line curved itself into kindness. Every kindness learned where to cut. The choir finished. The stones surrendered their alignment and resumed the secular task of not falling. The director closed the book with a gesture so modest it looked like apology. "Witness," he said to me at the door. "Eat." Then, quieter, as if he were speaking to the sentence I had written in the margin rather than to the man who wrote it. Small words can become carpenters if you give them time. In the corridor, ordinary lamplight. It is astonishing how quickly the world puts away its theater. I walked with the ugly poise of a man who has successfully helped a crime be tidy. On the stair, I met the moth-colored woman descending with a bundle of atlases that had changed their minds. She did not ask me what had happened. She asked, "What do you remember?" I answered with the only honest grammar left to a witness who has decided that nouns are insufficient. "I remember refusing," I said, not loudly. "Lately," she nodded. And I realized that the catacombs had already taught her the difference between noise and disobedience. In my cell, I did not pray. Prayer is not a ladder. On nights like this, it is a mirror. and I did not want to see my face made docile by devotion. I opened the witness book and read the line I had smuggled into its organ. Silence is enforced. Witness present. Ledger moved. Memory refuses full compliance. Then I did something I had not planned, something that the manuals do not account for. I copied that line by hand onto a small card, and beneath it I wrote in civilian script the scholar's baptismal name and the hour and the star, and I slid the card into a missal on a pew in the plain chapel where humble men teach themselves to be grateful for instructions. This was not courage, it was carpentry. A nail needs wood. The morning after a redistribution is always too clean. Breakfast remembered its recipes. Bells remembered their agreements with gravity. Men in corridors rehearsed politeness and discovered, with fresh relief, that it still fit. I sat at my desk and pretended to be a librarian while my hands traced, under the wood where no eye could see, the shape of the hinge I had refused to oil. I answered letters. I granted permissions. I loved my brothers. In the quiet way, a tired man loves the men who share his chores. Twice, I caught myself writing dates that belong to a century the copyists prefer to call weather. Twice, I corrected myself, and each correction tasted like surrender. By noon, a parcel arrived for the scriptorium. Parcels arrive every day. This one felt heavier than paper. Inside, a relic to be authenticated, a vial of liquid that by schedule would learn to weep. Beneath it, the maintenance schedule in a tidy hand. Wick changes on calends, sear the cap between displays, rehearse the story of the miracle until the docents can narrate it without tugging on their collars. Attached, a note. The scholar has accepted his consultancy. He is already gentle. I folded the note once, then again, then slid it beneath the blotter, and put the relic back in its box, the way one puts a child to bed, when the child believes that sleep is a test. I went to the chapel. The missal sat where I had left it. A finger had smudged the card. Someone had read, "I cannot tell you whether that someone was a cleaning woman, or a scholar wondering if his knees still work, or a boy who had been told that altars are where you practice wanting less. It does not matter who. Recognition is not a crown you place on a head. It is a contagion you hand from breath to breath until policy begins to cough." On the way back, the threader's handwriting grinned at me from a bulletin. "On Wednesdays, do not breathe too loudly." I laughed aloud this time, and a brother passing in the hall looked up, surprised by the noise, and smiled back before remembering that smiles in corridors are supposed to be small. In the afternoon, a letter arrived from a small college whose library had once paid the scholar to make their mornings feel like discovery. They regretfully acknowledge the rectifications. They would update their records at the earliest convenience. They thanked us for harmonizing. At the bottom, a PS in a hand too young to have learned discretion. I thought he taught us to be difficult. Perhaps I misremember. I wrote back the way a politeness manual would want me to. Then I copied the PS onto a slip and added it to the drawer where I had begun to keep counter-witness little unprayers that enter a book through the spine. Toward evening I found, tucked under the door of my cell, a note written in a semi-civilian hand, competent, unschooled in the glass flourish, the hand of a man who has spent his life teaching chalk to be brave. They will ask again for your breath. Breathe with someone else this time. Memory multiplies when shared. You cannot carry it alone without it turning into vanity. No signature. The paper smelled faintly of iron gall and old wool. I did not need a name. Names are ledgers, gestures are witnesses. I pressed the note into the back cover of the Index of Faces, and the book accepted it the way an old dog accepts a new routine. Night returned the room to honesty. The warded choir took up their positions and made the walls agree. Another exchange would come in a day, in a week, in a month. This house never hurries, because it does not believe in being late. I would be summoned. I would bring my neat hand and my hunger. I would plant, where the manuals permit, conscience, sentences that do not flatter their hosts. I would copy those sentences by hand and lose them in books that teach piety, and in books that teach arithmetic, and in Bibles with margins tired of being pure. I would whisper them to a woman who wipes brass with vinegar, and to a boy who thinks he wants to be a clerk because he admires good columns. I would begin to teach off-key. If the Micro-Canon moves memory, then memory must move back. I wish I could tell you that the scholar wrote to me, or that I met him in a market where olives teach men to be patient. I did not. A redistributed life does not make time for old recognition. But 2 weeks later, in a footnote in a journal that congratulates itself on not being read quickly, a line appeared whose style I knew better than I know my own pulse. We are indebted to a consultant who prefers to be forgotten. Any errors are ours, and they are the errors of remembering too little. It was nothing. It was a seed. I clipped it, and it sits now here, preserving its audacity like a saint bone that refuses to stop smelling like salt. There is, I think, a limit to the obedience even good men can commend to their lungs. The night of the exchange taught me the measure. It is the thickness of a margin. It is the space a breath occupies when it refuses to land where a book prefers. It is a card in a missile no one owns. It is a nail in a sentence that forces the reader to walk around it muttering. It is a ledger closed with affection by a man who has learned that affection is sometimes the only rebellion he is allowed to perform at work. What remains now is not the mechanics. I have told you those. What remains is the instruction, a thing I will not disguise as prayer, because prayer is too honest to be used like this. Keep a name. Keep it inconveniently. Keep it in 2 people at once. If they move memory, move witness. If they tune the room, sing against the pitch. If they ask for your breath, lend it to a page that will not count it. If they hide a chapel, draw its door in chalk every morning on the stone, until the chalk learns the grain and refuses to wash away. When I close my eyes, I still see the scholar's hand resting a moment on the wax. He did not bless it. He touched it the way a man says goodbye to an animal that has been faithful to the wrong master. I hear the director telling me to eat. I hear the custodian recalculating gentleness. I hear the choir tuning the stones. And underneath, almost too low to register, I hear the hinge in the door just once complain. It is the complaint I am counting on. Hinges remember the last time they refused to be quiet. So do men. The exchange was clean. The paperwork was beautiful. The mercy was administrative. But the margin bit down. A room blinked. A card wandered. A clerk coughed, reading a sentence that did not flatter him. And somewhere, a boy in a college that believes it is safe wrote a P.S. that refused to be dull. If they can move a soul's public face with seals, we can move a memory's private spine with breath. I have begun. It is ugly work. It is carpentry. It is also the only noise that does not become music in their rooms. Tomorrow they will summon me again. I will go. I will write, and I will refuse, in small, measurable, reproducible ways, to let the ledger be the only technology the past trusts. Silence isn't sacred. It is enforced. But enforcement, like any choir, can be taught to stumble. You have to cough at the right time. You have to sing the wrong note gently enough that the stones fall in love with your disobedience. And you have to keep a name not as a crown, neither as a relic, but as a hinge that has finally remembered how to complain. I promised you a confession. I have given you machinery. I have given you rooms that breathe like trained animals and choirs that teach stone to agree. I have given you clauses that pretend to be dull and seals that shine like the tidy conscience of a well-run office. What remains is not a place or a policy. What remains is the work the book cannot count. If you have listened this far, you are either stubborn, sleepless, or both. Stubbornness and sleeplessness are siblings. They share a bed and keep one eye open for the hinge that forgot to be quiet. You asked for a story for sleep. I have given you a story that sleeps with a light on. Now I will give you instructions, low-voiced, patient, not heroic, because heroism is loud, and they train rooms to handle loudness. It is the soft disobediences that leak through the seals. Begin here. Keep one name. You do not need to know the theology of ledgers or the algebra of witness drift. Keep a single name inconveniently alive. Keep it where your calendar would rather keep errands. Keep it where your phone keeps numbers you pretend you will call. Keep it in the strange cupboard in the mind where smells are filed next to songs. A kept name is not worship. It is carpentry. It gives memory a hinge. Then, pair your memory. The Micro-Canon privatizes souls. It nationalizes recognition. It cannot handle two people who insist, without paperwork, that a third has not been redistributed. Memorize someone jointly. If you must, make a ritual small enough to hide in a pocket. A word you will both say before eating. A line you will both underline in the book they forgot to make dull. If the ledger moves recognition by multiplying concordances, then you must move recognition by multiplying witness at breath scale. The book counts signatures. It does not count breaths. Make your breaths a census of refusal. Practice off-key. The warded choir taught me that beauty can be trained to behave like policy. Learn the devout art of singing wrong gently. Do not shatter the hymn. Tip it. Find the one note that unsettles a room without giving it an excuse to be scandalized. If you have never sung, begin with listening. In meetings, in pews, at tables where manners are the first and last sacrament, listen for the note that tells the room it is safe. Touch it with your finger. Move it a hair. Rooms remember the first disobedience that does not apologize. Write margins that bite. Most institutions, even the kind that censor, still perform piety to annotation. They leave a little white space around the text to prove they are not afraid of thought. Use it. If you keep ledgers, draft a line that a hasty auditor must read aloud. Small, neat, neutral. Silence is enforced. Witness present. Ledger moved. Memory refuses full compliance. Do not shout in the margin. Nails do not shout. They wait. Learn to lose paper in public, a card in a missal, a slip in an arithmetic primer, a phrase penciled into the legend beneath a museum reliquary, maintenance on kalends. Choose a tone so ordinary that only the attentive will be scratched by it. Scratches heal into tendernesses. People touch them and remember the wound long after the story of its making has been filed under weather. Refuse the lie that kindness equals concordance. They will marinate their procedures in mercy. They will say, "We spared him prison. We spared her flames. We spared the children the ruin of a difficult parent." Mercy is holy. Administrative mercy is a perfume they pour over policy. Smell for almonds where almonds do not belong. When you find them, open a window. If there is no window, breathe against the page. Practice a craft older than law. Teach someone to be difficult, tenderly. It is possible to graduate students in courage without calling it curriculum. Ask in public the question that is obvious and impolite. Offer your body as the person who goes first. Do it so gently that no one can mistake it for rage, although rage will wait with its coat on in the vestibule. Rage can help you carry boxes. It should not be allowed to write the labels. Memorize this sentence until it becomes a habit in your posture. Nothing changes except memory. Say it not as consent, but as diagnosis. When you hear it in other accents, that's just how things are now. We've moved on. Why reopen old wounds? Answer, with the stubborn grammar of a person who has trained himself to remember. If memory is the only variable, then memory is the field of battle and the refuge. Both. Battle because they are fighting for it. Refuge because you can hide people in it until the room that wants them tidy has grown tired. Go to your youngest. Do not tell them monsters. Teach them procedures. Show them how to spot a sentence that replaces thunder with policy. Give them one saint the calendar forgot, and let them keep her as if keeping were prayer. Give them one scientist whose curiosity was baptized against its will. Teach them the faces of boredom. There are several, and say, if boredom wears a seal, it is not boredom. It is anesthesia. Then show them the small work that wakes fingertips, a hinge that complains, a wick that smokes at the wrong hour, a ledger line that refuses to sit straight. Children trust crookedness when it limps honestly. Forgive yourself slowness. The Micro-Canon is slow. It does not hurry because it believes it will live as long as dust. I have learned to prize the slow treasons. The lunch that becomes a class in remembering. The errand that detours by a statue and whispers, "You used to have a name." The habit of writing dates with the old moon for a week after the reform so that your hand remembers the sky as argument and not decoration. Slowness is not the enemy of urgency. It is how urgency avoids spectacle. Rescue the ordinary from paperwork. They will convert the everyday into compliance, bread into schedule, bells into choreography. Interrupt a schedule with gratitude aimed at the wrong target. The woman who polishes brass, the man who oils hinges, the boy who stacks chairs as if gravity were a favor he owes the room. When thanked for their obedience, such people often remember being persons. The remembering spreads. At night, when your teeth have learned the warded pitch and want to obey, practice unison with the unseen. There is always someone, somewhere, refusing the ledger alone. Imagine their breath in your mouth. Imagine your breath in theirs. This is not mysticism. It is logistics for the disobedient. They coordinate seals. You coordinate sleep. If you cannot sleep, count refusals instead of sheep. If you fall asleep counting, you will have taught your body that rest can be rebellion too. Beware performances of despair. The book loves despair because it has learned how to collect it like a tax. Despair is measurable. It graphs well. It sits in boxes. Do not give them your despair in forms. Spend it privately. Convert it, where possible, into craft. A despair that makes a tool is technically misclassified. The book will try to file it under hope. Let it be misfiled if the tool works. Contaminate indexes. They think of indexes as conclusions. We must treat them as entry points. Write the subversive synonym, cross-reference, a concept with a verb instead of a noun, obedience, breathing, mercy, maintenance schedule, holiness, hinge, noise. An index that points to motion trains a reader to walk. Walking creates weather where policy had built a wall. If you keep a parish, a classroom, a shop whose broom closet hides a chapel of ledgers, keep a ledger of your own that the house cannot audit, a book of small restorations, a child who asked an old question, a professor who admitted her thesis went obedient 5 years ago and has been looking for the door back to difficulty since, a janitor who changed the wick on the weeping reliquary and left the cap unseared one night so the miracle could rest. These are trivialities. They are also maps. Do not despise maintenance. I once thought maintenance was the opposite of revelation, the tidy ongoing that prevents the apocalypse from clearing its throat. The scriptorium taught me that maintenance is where they hide miracles turned into theater. Therefore, we must hide counter-miracles in maintenance too. Oil what must squeak at the right hour. Fail to polish what should glare. Place a chair a little off so a meeting must notice its own choreography. A room that notices itself cannot fully obey. Ask, at least once a day, what the stone remembers. Buildings are sentimental. They cannot be redistributed. They can be made to agree, but agreement tires them. Touch a wall with 2 fingers and say the name you kept. The act is unmeasurable and therefore unbillable. It teaches your skin to be a margin. And lastly, because sleep deserves a benediction, do not stop asking questions. Ask them aloud when it is safe, and ask them silently when breath is the only witness. Ask them with the manners of a guest and the appetite of an heir. Ask them at doors that say, "Turn not." Ask them at tables where the seals lounge and the ribbons yawn. Ask them when mercy introduces itself too quickly. Ask them when the choir sounds like numbers behaving. Ask them when you love a thing, and loyalty wants to autograph your throat. They fear many inconveniences, leaks, rumors, saints that grow back after redistribution like stubborn ivy. But the most dangerous thing to them is memory coming back. Memory that returns does not arrive alone. It brings friends, witness, craft, the itch in a hinge, the small laugh in a corridor where jokes are illegal because they draw blood to the surface of a face and make recognition bloom uninvited. You are tired. So am I. Tired is honest. Let it be blanket, not eraser. If you must sleep, sleep like an archivist arms around a box that is not yours, promising it out loud that you will not let the morning teach you to forget what the night insisted on telling. If you cannot sleep, let wakefulness learn to murmur names, the way the sea murmurs the coast into remembering it is not finished. I was a priest, and I loved the house I have betrayed. Betrayal, when it is holy, is fidelity to the thing beneath the paint. If you cannot forgive me, keep a name anyway. It will forgive both of us. If you can forgive me, do not make a statue of that forgiveness. Statues are how they train gratitude to stand still. One more confession before the lights lower. I am not brave. I am a librarian whose neat hand learned to be a splinter. Splinters do not win wars. They enter skin and make tools drop. Drop a tool tonight. A thought, a mannerism, a way of agreeing before you've heard the sentence. Drop it gently enough that no one flinches, and obviously enough that someone notices the absence and asks, "Where did it go?" Answer, if you must answer at all. It went where memory keeps the names that paper would prefer to shelve as weather. Now the candle is low, and we have arrived where all honest documentaries end. The corridor, the open door, the camera lingering as the witness walks away smaller, not because he has been diminished, but because he has stopped blocking the view. The room will close itself. The ledger will nap. The seal will dream of surfaces it has not yet kissed, and you who asked for sleep will finally be allowed to drift. Before you do, keep this between the teeth like a seed, and if you wake in the night with the taste of iron gall and almonds and stone good, that is the world reminding you it still has hinges. Do not stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing to them is memory coming back. If you need a blessing not from the house, but from the people the house keeps forgetting to count, take this one. May your breath be misfiled. May your margins be read aloud. May your off-key note be the one the stones learn to love. May the name you keep find its way home by the sound of you remembering it inconveniently. Sleep now, and when you wake, begin again with a name.